I am interrogator militant Kalia Voss, Ordo Hereticus, attached by writ of Inquisitor Halleck to a joint audit of Cantus 66, the Adeptus Mechanicus, organ foundry, over Hive Callast on Vespera Secundus. I recorded that designation into 3 skulls and the shuttle's cogitator, so there would be no ambiguity when the minutes were assembled and doubt came hunting. We had been in high-orbit dry dock for 32 minutes when the dead guardsman sang. He hung in Bay 9, frostbitten and still rotating from the decompression that had taken him, jaw wired shut, tongue a black stone in a blue mouth. No air, no pressure, no medium for sound to travel. Yet the Te Deum rose from him as if poured through a pipe, pure and ecclesiastic, each line closing on the same descending 6-note cadence. We all heard it, through open vox and unaided ear, as if the sound had found another path to our ears entirely. Magos Tertius Ol, red-robed and bone-pale beneath his augmetics, said nothing, but his auspex wand trembled like a tuning fork. The bay reminded me of a reliquary stripped and left cold. Glass panes starred with impact fractures, tools tethered on red cords, moving with a motion that belonged to nothing I could name. There was a taste of copper at the back of my tongue, metallic and sharp, and the pressure in my sinuses came and went in waves. The Te Deum stopped when I looked directly at the corpse, like a child caught mid-prayer with sweets stolen from the altar, and started again when I glanced aside. Trooper Sarah, one of the governor's loaned Vox Blacks, crossed herself and whispered the litany of silence under her breath. The final word left her lips and all our Vox units stuttered. For a heartbeat, the world inside the helmets and out was absent of any sound at all. Then the bay returned, and so did the hymn. My orders had come directly from Inquisitor Thaddeus Vex himself, transmitted via astropathic relay from the fortress monastery on Cadia's edge. The anomaly had been described in the mission brief as persistent auditory artifacts originating in Mechanicus estate grid. The subclause below that line had read, mass absenteeism in lower servitor tiers, possible unionization impulse in junior lay mechanics, probable cult. But there was a note appended by someone using my late mentor's cipher. The note read, proceed with diligence, Kalia. Veil the blade in liturgy. We had less than 20 hours by the hive clock until the High Feast of Resonance, a civic rite repurposed by the Adeptus Mechanicus as an auditory blessing. Music would be carried through the hive's structural pipes and municipal vox to synchronize every sector for a month of quotas. Every voice would be bound into the same cant for the duration of the feast. If there was corruption in that stream, it would touch 1 billion throats. Protocol demanded the skulls make a triangulation of the singing corpse. They produced 3 different points of origin. I wrote it into the log anyway, noting the hexagonal servo seals that had appeared on surfaces where none should exist, the recurring 6-note phrase that witnesses described as beautiful but wrong, and references to something called the Litany of Silence that appeared in no approved imperial liturgy. We sealed Bay 9, and I signed the red paper that made that decision legal. As the shuttle's clamps released, Ol spoke a string of Binharic appeasements, clipped and impossible to hear without training. His voice was thin as wire, and I noticed his augmetic eye flickered each time the corpse's hymn reached its 6th note. The pilot announced our descent. Through the forward ports the planet turned, a dark plate with light points and a girdling of ash weather. Hive Callast's crown rose out of that ash like the vertebra of some titanic neck, cathedral vox crania, an iron spire at the summit. The landing struts of our shuttle shrieked against the ferrocrete, a metallic lament that momentarily drowned the impossible hymn still resonating through my skull. The air that rushed into the disembarkation ramp was thick, not with the expected industrial reek of a hive, but with a cloying, moist heat, like breath held too long in a sealed chamber. A fine, glittering dust, metallic and cold, despite the humidity, coated the landing zone. Trooper Kale stumbled, clutching his ear. Interrogator, my head. It's like a hive of grox flies nesting in my skull. Before I could respond, Trooper Lyra coughed, a thin stream of crimson tracing from her nostril. Blood, she rasped. I can taste copper. I do not love hives. They have too much in common with skulls and prisons. This one greeted us with a mechanical sigh through the docking seals, as if it recognized us, and from the first moment our mag boots touched the platform, I could feel it, an under-rhythm. It was not sound, not in the conventional sense. It thrummed in my bones when I tightened my glove, pattered behind my eyes when I blinked. We conducted the entry rites at the Mechanicus gate. I led with the litany of access, calm and measured, and Ol followed with a harsher, chittering cant that belonged to the priests. The door was a hex, each segment stamped with the sigil of Sonat Lexis, deceased master of this place. I noted the geometry. The gate parted in 6 equal slides, each one finishing a half-breath apart, so that the opening itself had a cadence you could not avoid noticing if your mind was trained to rhythms as mine was. The air that came out was damp and laced with machine oils and that faint copper again. The temperature fell by 4 degrees as we crossed the threshold. Sarah's breath fogged. Mine did not. The first Vox anomaly on planet came as we entered the Surveyor's Hall. My skulls clicked and skittered to their assigned pattern points and began their quiet, whirring capture. The auspex in my left vambrace sent me a ribbon of text. Ambient decibels rising, no discrete source. Waveforms large enough to be felt. Then a band of static rolled across our channel, clean and total, erasing all instrumentation. For 2 breaths there was nothing. Then my own voice arrived from our future, riding on a single pure tone, recorded in a cadence I do not use for field reports. Do not answer the 6th note, I said very distinctly. The timestamp placed the transmission 18 hours ahead. Sarah swore and locked her jaw. Ol's flesh eyelid twitched, the surgical sutures connecting it to his augmetic brow, pulling taut. I cut the volume and wrote the fact into the log as if it would grow less true when confined to paper and oath. The skulls recorded the message and pinged a duplicate up the chain toward orbit. The shuttle acknowledged receipt on a second attempt, the first lost to silence. We saw our first servitor rack in sub-beta, lightless except for Ol's staff and the skull's probes. 6 racks, 6 bays per rack, 6 conduits running overhead. The arrangement repeated down the corridor like a recited number. Most of the iron cradles were empty. Those that were not held the remnants of bodies with their faces serenely turned to a window that did not exist. Their mandibles were braced to hold, their throats collared to silence. Yet the iron frames thrummed under my palm, sympathetic vibration without any feed source. The servitor racks, meant to be inert until activated, began to vibrate with a sub-audible resonance, swaying minutely without visible power. Every 6th minute, with unnerving precision, a distant bell tolled. It was not metal on metal, but something deeper, a pressure behind the breastbone that rang for exactly 6 seconds. When it extinguished itself, the hallway was left an inch colder, and the condensation had arranged itself into neat hex rosettes along the pipework. I took a sample with a glass slide and a prayer. The deeper corridors had been designed with an aesthetic that wanted to be austere, but betrayed the human hands that had smoothed it. Hexagonal plates sealed certain doors. Some had been opened and resealed. The wax of their purity laces cracked and shiny. My fingertip touched one such seal and came away with a smear of crimson beneath the wax. Old blood that had not dried as it should. Ol saw my glance and leaned in, breathing a Binharic query into the plate. The machine spirit within clicked once, twice, as if picking through memories. It answered him by tracing 6 identical circles in dust on the floor, though neither of us had moved. We reached the lower annex airlock with that knot bell still jittering my marrow. The lock's wheel bore the hex sigil again, 6 spokes converging on a devotional scar where someone had kissed the iron often enough to pit it. Ol keyed a ritual, and then another, when the first was not accepted. The machine spirit did not open. I laid my palm on the hub, and recited the litany of silence, careful and exact. The second stanza, the one no catechist ever teaches out loud, fell from my tongue as if someone else had greased it. I had not spoken that portion since my mentor died. The wheel moved 1/4 turn and waited, as if for a reply. We stood motionless in air that had no smell. It had had oil and copper and damp, and now it had nothing. Ol's Auspex readouts flattened into calm lines. In that absence, my voice from the future spoke from every device and no device at once, soft and terribly intimate. Do not answer the 6th note, I told myself again, but the words were not a warning this time. They were a shape, and the wheel under my palm was warm now, and the lock's 6 spokes clicked in sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then something on the other side knocked. It was not metal on metal. It was knuckle on wood. It knocked 6 times and waited for me to answer. I did not answer the 6th knock. The training carved into my bones by a decade of catechism held my hand steady on the wheel's hub, though every instinct screamed to complete the pattern. The future me had been precise in her warning. Do not answer the 6th note. I drew my fingers back from the warm metal and let that final beat pass like a held breath that burns. The wheel considered our refusal, its spokes ticking once for each minute we had spent in the estate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the locking pins retracted without the 6th click, as if some unseen presence had finished the ritual for us while refusing to acknowledge the completion. The airlock cycled with a mechanical wheeze that belonged in a medici bay, not a foundry. The door did not swing open, but backed away into a recess we could not see, the metal flexing like the palate of a mouth making room for words. Cold air rushed past us, thick with humidity and the metallic taste of copper that had become our constant companion. The passage beyond should not have existed according to Ol's schematics, yet it stretched ahead in a gentle curve, its walls lined with what appeared to be organ pipes grown rather than forged. Each pipe stood precisely 6 feet in height, arranged in banks of 6, their pale surfaces threaded with darker veins like blood vessels beneath skin. The mouths were sealed with membranes that pulsed faintly, and as we approached, I could feel warmth radiating from their surfaces. The air here carried a new quality, humid and warm like the inside of a mouth. Sarah's breathing quickened behind her rebreather. "Interrogator," she whispered. "The pipes. They're breathing." Ol extended his auspex toward the nearest bank, its machine spirit chittering in rapid binharik. The readings defied conventional parameters. Organic matter registered as mineral. Temperature fluctuated between samples, and atmospheric composition showed trace elements that belonged in blood, not air. "Bioacoustic resonators," he explained, his voice carrying an odd harmonic as if the corridor itself was shaping his words. "Sanctioned for cathedral vox baffle production. The flesh is cultured from approved genetic templates." I ran my gauntleted fingers along one of the pipes, feeling the pulse beneath its surface. The membrane at its mouth dimpled inward at my touch, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt breath against my palm. The sensation brought an immediate taste of copper so strong it made my eyes water. My data slate bore the authorization for this bioacoustic project. Emergency sanction signed 3 months ago. The cipher at the bottom made my stylus tremble in my grip. My mentor's mark, the same signature I had seen in my mission orders. We descended deeper into the foundry complex, past chambers filled with progressively larger resonators. Some required structural supports that had been grown rather than built, their surfaces pocked with what looked like pores. The massive pipes hummed with subsonic frequencies that I felt in my chest cavity, a resonance that made my ribs ache. Every 6th step, the floor beneath us vibrated in sympathy with that distant bell, though we had descended far enough that no surface bell should reach us here. The walls themselves had begun to change, their metal surfaces giving way to something organic, ribbed and curved like the interior of some vast throat. Metallic frost coated every surface in delicate hexagonal patterns, glinting under our lumen's glow. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since we entered, yet the humidity remained oppressive, making each breath feel thick and laboured. Sarah stumbled, her hand pressed to her ear, blood seeping between her fingers. "The pressure," she gasped. "It's like being underwater, but the water is singing." We encountered our first servitor in Chamber Hex 7, a designation that appeared nowhere in the original plans. The creature had been a woman once, her skull opened and filled with harmonic amplifiers, her throat expanded with additional vocal cords that gleamed wet in the lumen's glow. She hung suspended in a web of cables that fed into her spine at regular intervals, her mouth open in a perfect circle. No sound emerged that we could hear, but the air around her shimmered with heat distortion, and my Auspex registered massive acoustic output in frequencies beyond human perception. "She sings constantly," Ole explained, his augmetic eye focusing and refocusing on the suspended form. "The harmonics are channeled through the pipe network to create standing wave patterns throughout the hive structure." His voice carried an admiration that chilled me more than the Foundry's artificial breath. I noted how his flesh hand had begun to move in small, repetitive patterns, tracing hexagonal shapes in the air. The servitor's eyes tracked our movement, despite her apparent catatonia. When I stepped directly in front of her, her lips moved soundlessly, forming words I recognized from the litany of silence. The sixth word of each line was different, replaced by something that made my teeth ache to witness. Her throat convulsed and she spoke, her voice a perfect replica of my own. "Do not answer the sixth note." Then her mouth sealed itself with a membrane identical to those capping the organ pipes. We pressed deeper into the complex, following conduit markings toward what Ole identified as the primary resonance chamber. The pipes grew larger and more complex, their surfaces etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Some bore inscriptions in Gothic that I recognized as fragments of approved liturgies, but the words were arranged in sequences that inverted their meaning. The 23rd Psalm became a summoning rather than a comfort. The Te Deum transformed into something that made my gorget feel tight around my throat. In Chamber Hex 13, we found evidence of what had happened to the missing personnel. A dozen tech adepts sat in perfect formation around a hexagonal table, their heads tilted back at identical angles, their mouths opened wide enough to accommodate the small organ pipes that had been inserted into their throats. The pipes pulsed with the rhythm of their hearts, drawing breath from their lungs and transforming it into harmonics that fed into the chamber's acoustic matrix. Their eyes were open but unseeing, pupils dilated to black circles that reflected our lumens like dark mirrors. One of them was still conscious enough to track our approach. As I knelt beside him, his augmetic jaw clicked in binary cant. Ole translated, his voice growing thin with each word. He says they volunteered. The song was beautiful. They wanted to become part of it. He says the sixth note is coming, and when it arrives, the whole hive will sing as one. The bell tolled then, precisely on schedule. 6 seconds of pressure that made the chamber's walls pulse in response. As the echo faded, a whisper coiled through the air, barely audible above the omnipresent hum. It was a voice reciting the litany of silence, but backwards, each sacred phrase unmade and inverted. The voice was dry, authoritative, and terribly familiar. It belonged to my mentor, Canoness Verena, speaking words she would have cut out her own tongue before blaspheming. The backwards litany slid under and through our responses like oil, coming from the sealed chambers around us, from the walls themselves, from inside my skull. I did not recognize it immediately, because the cadence was reversed and the pitch was wrong. But when understanding came, it brought with it the cold certainty that whatever was happening in Cantus 66 had been planned long before our arrival. I checked my chronometer. 17 hours until the high feast of resonance. The tech adept's binary cant continued, faster now, more urgent, and Ol's translation became a whisper. He says the song has been waiting. He says it knows we're here. The pipes in the man's throat pulsed once, twice, and then began to sing in harmonies that made the chamber's organic walls contract like muscle. The sound was not quite human, not quite machine, but something that belonged to neither and both, and it was calling to something vast and patient in the depths below us. The harmonies rising from the tech adept's throat pipes carved themselves deeper than sound should reach, etching visible grooves into the chamber's organic walls that wept a fluid tasting of copper pennies and altar wine. I could feel the resonance in my marrow, each note a pressure that made my ribs ache in sympathy. The backwards litany of silence grew stronger, Canoness Verina's voice threading through the acoustic matrix with the precision of a surgical blade, each inverted sacred phrase cutting away at something fundamental in the air around us. Ol's auspex flickered and died, its machine spirit fleeing rather than process what it witnessed. When the device reset with a cascade of panicked servos, the readings defied every principle of acoustics I knew. "Interrogator," he said, his voice thin with revelation. "The harmonic frequencies are creating standing wave patterns, but they're not following natural physics. The system is compensating. When we cut power, it enriches the standing wave. It drinks the absence." His augmetic eye focused and refocused on streams of data that hurt to witness directly. "These modifications predate the official sanction by 6 months. Someone has been preparing for this moment long before your mentor signed the authorization." The implications struck like a physical blow. Every tech adept in the circle turned their unseeing eyes toward us in perfect synchronization, their throat pipes pulsing with renewed vigor. Trooper Kale, who had been muttering prayers under his breath, suddenly choked. His hand flew to his throat, eyes widening in horror as his mouth opened to speak, but produced instead a perfectly formed, resonant "Amen" in a voice that was not his own. Every sixth word that followed was replaced by that same liturgical response, as if an invisible choirmaster was correcting his every utterance. Sarah's recording equipment sparked and died, its machine spirit abandoning its post rather than capture the blasphemy unfolding before us. The chamber's walls contracted like muscle, forcing us closer to the singing circle, and I realized with growing dread that the room was not merely responding to the harmonies, it was participating in them. The organic architecture pulsed in rhythm with the tech adepts' hearts, their modified bodies becoming resonance chambers for something vast and patient that waited in the depths below. We withdrew with discipline born from close work, with things that should not be, following corridors that curved like the interior of some titanic throat. The skull familiar designated Telos 3 returned from reconnaissance, trailing threads of what looked like candle soot, its optics dimmed in mechanical distress. The image it transmitted to my inner lens made my breath catch, a chamber of devastating simplicity, 6 rings concentric around a core platform, 6 galleries above, 6 doors sealed by hex sigils. The caption it provided in its limited lexicon was one word that chilled me more than the Foundry's artificial breath: choir. The deeper passages revealed the true scope of the corruption. Bone pipes lined the walls in banks of 6, their pale surfaces threaded with darker veins that pulsed with visible fluid. Each pipe stood precisely 6 feet in height, their mouths sealed with membranes that breathed in sympathy with something we could not see. Ol's data slate flickered with glyphs that belonged to no standard Mechanicus cant. Hexadecimal chorals arranged in patterns that made my eyes water to perceive directly. Protocol. Hex cant, he translated, his voice growing hoarse. A counter-resonance schema designed to nullify specific frequencies. But the 6th interval has been deliberately excised and replaced with something else entirely. Trooper Lyra stumbled against the wall, her medici scar, a thin white line from temple to jaw, beginning to twitch with unnatural life. The skin around it rippled, and before any of us could react, the scar split open to form a tiny, perfectly circular mouth. From this impossible orifice came a whisper in my own voice. "Do not answer the sixth note." The words were followed by a wet, sealing sound as the scar closed, leaving no trace of its brief, horrifying function. Lyra's scream was mercifully her own, raw and wordless in the oppressive silence that had begun to replace the omnipresent hum. The choir chamber spread before us, like the nave of a cathedral made of anatomy, its walls not built but grown, its galleries not constructed but cultured from living tissue. A ring of lobotomized servitors hung from braided cords that passed through their shoulder girdles. Their throats opened wide and fitted with membranes stretched like drumheads across frames of yellowed bone. Each breath that rose from their lungs struck those membranes and returned as harmonics that could never pass a human tongue, yet carried the terrible suggestion of words. At the chamber's heart sat a reliquary box of blackened iron, bound with 6 wax seals bearing the sigil of Sonat Lexis. Beneath those marks, faint but unmistakable, lay the broken ring that had been my mentor's cipher when she wished her involvement to remain hidden. The box vibrated under my approaching palm like a caged bird, and I withdrew my hand before contact could complete some ritual I did not understand. A lectern in a side alcove held a codex scroll bound in pitch-black ribbons stamped with hexagonal seals. The text within was a schema of prayer rather than machinery, the prayer of 6 silences, each interval paired to dampener frequencies designed to nullify the exact 6-note cadence that had infected everything we touched. The 6th interval was present in the original text, then crossed out with surgical precision. In its place, written in a hand I knew as well as my own reflection, was a single word: erasure. From the chamber's far wall, where only smooth surface had been moments before, letters began to emerge as if pressed from the other side by careful hands. They spelled my full name and designation in High Gothic, the condensation running down to complete the serifs with mathematical precision. When the text was complete, it spoke in perfect mechanicus cant, a voice that came from no visible mouth. "Your voice is the key." The reliquary box snapped one of its wax seals with the soft sound of a kiss. Cold air sank from the opening, carrying scents of old incense and something cooking far away. The choir of servitors paused on the same half-breath, held in perfect suspension, waiting. Behind the walls, something vast knocked 6 times in those nearly human intervals that betrayed conscious will. My future voice coiled from the reliquary's narrow opening, paired to a tone so pure it made my eyes stream. "Do not answer the 6th note." The 5th knock landed and hung like a held bell. The 6th approached with the patience of geological time, and I felt the foundry watching me with the attention of a predator that had been hunting for longer than human memory could encompass. The humidity rose until every surface sweated, and somewhere in the distance, that bell tolled its 6-second warning. 15 hours until the high feast of resonance would carry this corruption to every throat in the hive. The reliquary's lid lifted the breadth of a breath, and from within came the whisper of my childhood name, spoken in a voice I had thought silenced forever. My childhood name hung in the air like incense smoke, spoken with the precise cadence my mother had used when the Hablock's heating failed and we huddled together against the cold. The reliquary's lid trembled on the edge of opening, held back by 5 remaining wax seals that bore the weight of whatever waited within. Every instinct screamed to answer, to complete the pattern that had been so carefully prepared. But my mentor's future warning echoed in my skull. "Do not answer the 6th note." The chamber's temperature plummeted between one heartbeat and the next, frost forming in perfect hexagonal rosettes across every surface. My breath came in visible clouds that held their shape too long, hanging in the air like prayers made manifest before being drawn toward the reliquary's narrow opening with unnatural hunger. The choir of servitors resumed their impossible harmonies, but the sound had changed. Where before it had been merely inhuman, Now it carried the lullaby cadences of my novitiate years, each note precisely tuned to memory yet threaded with an undertone that made my gorget feel tight around my throat. I forced my trembling hand toward the reliquary's lid, pushing past every instinct that screamed retreat. The remaining seals cracked in sequence, second, third, fourth, each break releasing whispers of air that tasted of copper pennies and altar wine. Within, nestled on a bed of blackened petals that might once have been white, lay a single bone, no, larger than my thumb, curved with elegant, terrible precision. The hyoid bone of St. Callista, I realized with cold certainty that stole my breath. It was famed throughout the sector for its purity, a relic said to have sung praises to the emperor, even as the saint's throat was slit by heretics. But this bone was not merely a relic, it was a tool. Its surface bore intricate hexagonal lattices, etched so fine they seemed part of the bone's very structure, and within those microscopic matrices, written in a hand I knew as well as my own reflection, was the complete inverted litany of silence. My mentor's cipher, precise and elegant, marking every syllable. The betrayal bloomed in my mind like a flower of ice. Canoness Verena had not merely sanctioned this abomination, she had designed it, provided the key, prepared the trap that had waited decades for the right voice to spring it. Ol's augmetic eye flickered through spectrums of analysis, its machine spirit struggling to process readings that violated every principle of acoustics. "Interrogator," he said, his voice carrying new harmonics that belonged in neither human throat nor vox unit. "The bioacoustic resonators are not producing sound. They are creating sympathetic vibrations in living tissue. The frequencies match human vocal patterns, but inverted. It learns to speak by listening to us speak backwards." His data slate pulsed with frantic glyphs that hurt to perceive directly. When we cut power, the system compensates. It drinks absence. Counternulls fold inward, enriching the standing wave. The implications struck like a physical blow. Every word we had spoken since entering Cantor 66 had been captured, analyzed and inverted by whatever intelligence guided this corruption. Our voices had become the raw material for its terrible eloquence. As I stared at the saint's hyoid, it pulsed with faint light, matching the rhythm of that distant bell, and I heard my own voice echoing from its surface with perfect, mocking clarity. "Do not answer the sixth note." Trooper Sarah's hand flew to her throat as understanding dawned, her lips moving in silent prayer that produced no sound, yet caused the chamber's walls to pulse in sympathy. From her equipment pack came the sharp crack of failing electronics. Her recording devices, sparking and dying as their machine spirits fled, rather than capture the blasphemy unfolding before us. The organic walls began to contract in rhythm with our heartbeats, forcing us closer to the reliquary and its terrible contents. My data slate chimed with an incoming transmission that should have been impossible, orbital frequencies blocked by the hive's structural interference, yet the signal rode through on harmonics that bypassed conventional physics entirely. The message was brief, encoded in my mentor's private cipher, time-stamped 6 hours in our future. "The saint's hyoid has been breached. Initiate protocol erasure immediately. The sixth note is not addition, it is subtraction. Do not let it complete the silence." Ol's readings climbed into impossible regimes. Telemetry confirms planetary defense macro cannons are jammed by harmonic interference. The Vox channels are saturated with subsonic pretones from the underhive. The corruption is not confined to Cantor 66. It spreads through the hive's infrastructure like a geometric contagion. His flesh hand trembled as he processed the data streams. "The high feast rehearsal is imminent. 14 hours, 37 minutes on the hive clock." The saint's hyoid pulsed once, twice, and began to sing, not with sound but with absence, frequencies that carved themselves directly into the soul without troubling the ear. The chamber's lumens flickered and died with absolute finality, not dimming, but extinguishing as if the light itself had been consumed. The darkness that descended was not merely the absence of illumination, but a physical presence, thick and suffocating, pressing against us with the weight of centuries. In that profound black sound began to die. Footsteps became muffled thuds, voices dropped to whispers that the air swallowed before they could reach our ears. The acoustic matrix was not just corrupted, it was feeding, consuming the very medium through which we communicated, leaving us isolated in pools of silence that contracted with each breath. Trooper Cale's panicked breathing became a barely audible rasp, then nothing at all, though I could see his chest rising and falling in the faint glow of our Auspex displays. The Saint's hyoid pulsed one final time, and from the darkness came the sixth note, not heard but felt, a resonance that bypassed every sense to reach directly into the architecture of reality itself. It was not addition, but erasure, not sound, but the shape that sound left when it was unmade. The bones sang with the voice of absence, and in its terrible harmony I heard the promise of what was to come. A silence so complete it would consume not just sound, but the very possibility of sound, spreading through the hive's acoustic network to touch every throat in Kalast. The reliquary snapped shut with a sound like breaking bone, sealing the Saint's hyoid within its iron embrace. But the damage was done. The sixth note hung in the air like a held breath, and somewhere in the darkness beyond our failing lumens, something vast and patient began to answer its call. The high feast of resonance was less than 15 hours away, and the song that would carry to every corner of the hive was no longer entirely human. The darkness that descended after the Saint's hyoid sealed itself was not empty, but gravid with absence, pressing against us like the weight of deep water that had never known light. My Auspex flickered back to life with readings that defied comprehension, sound levels climbing while my ears registered nothing but the faintest whisper of our own laboured breathing. The sixth note had carved a wound in reality's fabric, and through that breach something vast was bleeding into our world, consuming sound itself as sustenance. I raised my hand to signal withdrawal and realized with growing horror that I could no longer hear the joints of my gauntlet articulate. The Saint's bone had taught the foundry how to unmake sound, and it was practicing with surgical precision. My whispered orders produced nothing but the shape of words, my mouth forming syllables that died before reaching the air. Sarah touched my shoulder twice, ready, then once, afraid. We switched to prayer tap and hand sign, the gutters of combat communication, where liturgy becomes language in places that deny your senses on principle. The corridor ahead curved like the interior of some titanic throat, and there we discovered our first silence well. The air bent at that junction. That was the only word that fit what we witnessed. Sarah stepped into the distortion and vanished from us, not in sight, but in sound and pressure. Her lumens still traced a frigid ring in the oppressive dark, but the step she made ceased to exist. The safety line to Lyra went limp as if severed, and the condensation on her armor boiled away without heat. For half a breath, my hand moved toward the space where she should be, the old compulsion to complete the pattern with the sixth touch, the sixth click, the sixth note. I clenched my fingers into the iron sign of the Aquila until pain replaced the urge. The well released her with the wet sound of suction that carried no echo, and Sarah reeled back into my shoulder plate. Her visor fogged from within, and her throat convulsed as she tried to scream. But what emerged was perfect silence. Under my palm, I felt the vibrations of a scream, flawless in every harmonic, yet entirely absent from the air. She was singing voicelessly, her vocal cords retuned to frequencies that existed in the spaces between sounds. Ol's data slate flickered with impossible readings as his augmetic eye cycled through spectrums that hurt to witness. Echophage, he managed through hand signs and scrawled notes, his augmetic throat producing words that died before reaching our ears. The acoustic matrix inverts everything, anti-sound frequencies that cancel rather than create. When the high feast begins, every voice in the hive will sing backwards liturgies to something that hungers for prayer turned inside out. My Voxcaster crackled with an incoming transmission that bypassed the silence through sheer bureaucratic momentum. Governor Valerius's voice cut through the static with imperial authority. Interrogator Voss, this is Governor Valerius. My confessor reports your unauthorized activities disrupting pre-feast preparations. The High Feast of Resonance will proceed as scheduled. Economic Ordinance 66A mandates festival continuity. Any further deviation will be met with extreme prejudice. The transmission died, replaced by unauthorized siren tests echoing from the upper hive. The emergency klaxons were not wailing warnings, but performing harmonic sequences, their tones cutting through the echophage with precision that chilled my blood. They were singing the 6-note cadence, teaching the corruption to spread through the hive's acoustic infrastructure like a geometric contagion. I pressed my palm to a hardline altar and recited the litany of silence, not backwards as the walls craved, but in the old way, pauses as important as words. The machine's spirit resisted, then listened. I wrote in my mentor's cipher, to Confessor Hieronymus, assemble voices trained in 6 silences, not feast hymns, no accompaniment, seal doors when assembled, do not complete sets of 6. Above the text I scratched quietus and sealed it with wax from my purity seal. The reply came stamped with incense and dread. Confessor resists. Governor Enforcer present. Economic Ordinance supersedes. I carved deeper with my stylus until sparks flew. Emergency Ecclesiarchy Authority by Inquisitorial Warrant. The plate accepted it. Verbum est, choir summoned. Then, irregularly. 1 dampener device missing from archive. Sabotage confirmed. Trooper Kale suddenly stiffened, his hands pressed to his temples, throat vibrating with visible intensity. He was caught in a silence well, singing without sound, his body transformed into a living resonator for the frequencies that had been erased. The corruption was spreading through our ranks, using our own voices as instruments for its terrible symphony. My data slate chimed with another temporal anomaly, a transmission from our future-bearing coordinates that led to the hive's central shaft. The message was brief, but devastating. 6 dampeners deployed at calculated intervals. Counter-resonance achieved for 37 minutes. System adapted. Echophage learns faster than we can silence it. Proceeding to primary nexus beneath Cathedral Vox Crania. If this fails, recommend orbital bombardment. The coordinates revealed chambers that should not exist according to any Imperial survey, spaces carved into the hive's foundation, where something had been waiting far longer than human settlement on Vespera Secundus. The Saint's hyoid pulsed with renewed vigor through the reliquary's iron walls, its song of absence growing stronger as we approached whatever dwelt in those depths. Lyra stumbled, her medicae scar splitting open to form a tiny mouth that whispered my childhood name before sealing itself. The corruption was becoming personal, intimate, using our own bodies as conduits for its spreading influence. When she tried to scream, only silence emerged, yet the chamber walls pulsed in sympathy with her unheard anguish. The walls began to contract in rhythm with our heartbeats, forcing us deeper into passages that breathed around us like living tissue. Hexagonal patterns etched themselves into every surface, glowing with phosphorescence that made my eyes water. Each pattern was a fragment of the inverted litany of silence, my mentors, betrayal spreading through the hive's very structure like infection through blood. We sealed the corrupted chamber behind us with prayers and demolition charges, leaving Kale to his silent song with the weight of necessity crushing my chest. The counterchoir was assembling above, voices trained in the 6 silences preparing to fight sound with shaped absence. But I understood now that the solution was also the trap. The litany of silence inverted was designed not to contain, but to attract, to lure voices to their own erasure. 12 hours remained until the high feast of resonance. The Saint's hyoid sang its approval through iron walls, each pulse a countdown to the moment when every throat in Hive calloused would join the chorus that sang reality backwards into something that should never be. The deeper shafts beckoned with their promise of answers and their threat of truths too vast for human comprehension, while above us, the unauthorized sirens continued their harmonic rehearsal, teaching the Hive to breathe in patterns of 6. We descended toward the primary nexus, where the true architect of this corruption waited, and with each step, the silence grew heavier, more expectant, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of the song that would unmake the world. The darkness that descended was not absence, but presence, a weight that pressed against us like deep water that had never known light. My lumens did not dim, but died, their machine spirits fleeing rather than witness what the saint's hyoid had birthed. The silence that followed carried mass, texture, hunger, not the lack of sound, but something that fed on sound's possibility, consuming the very medium through which reality spoke to itself. Footsteps that had echoed with metallic certainty became muffled thuds, then whispers, then nothing at all. My gauntlet joints, which should have articulated with mechanical precision, moved in perfect silence, as if the air had grown too thick to carry vibration. Sarah's labored breathing faded to nothing, though I could see her chest rising and falling in desperate rhythm. The acoustic matrix was not corrupted, but transformed, teaching itself to drink sound as sustenance. I raised my hand to signal withdrawal, and heard only the shape of the gesture, a phantom echo that existed in memory rather than air. My whispered orders died before leaving my throat, syllables forming in my mouth only to be erased by the hungry darkness. We dropped to hand sign and prayer tap, the gutters of combat communication where liturgy becomes command in places that deny your senses on principle. The corridor ahead curved like the interior of some titanic throat, and there Sarah encountered our first silence well. The air itself bent at that junction, distorting in ways that violated every principle of physics. She stepped into the distortion and vanished from us, not in sight but in presence, in the pressure of her existence. Her lumen still traced its frigid ring through the oppressive dark, but the steps she made ceased to exist. The safety line connecting her to Lyra went slack, as if severed by invisible shears. The well released her with a wet sound of suction that carried no echo, and she stumbled back into my shoulder plate. Her visor fogged from within as she tried to scream, but what emerged was perfect silence shaped like anguish. Under my palm, I felt the vibrations of terror, flawless in every harmonic yet entirely absent from the air. She was singing voicelessly, her vocal cords retuned to frequencies that existed in the spaces between sounds. Ol's augmetic eye cycled through spectrums that hurt to witness, his data slate pulsing with readings that defied comprehension. Through hastily scrawled notes, he conveyed the terrible truth. Echophage, an acoustic engine that inverted everything, creating anti-sound frequencies that cancelled rather than created. When the high feast began, every voice in the hive would sing backwards liturgies to something that hungered for prayer turned inside out. My voxcaster crackled with Governor Valerius's transmission, his voice cutting through the corruption with imperial authority that brooked no dissent. The High Feast of Resonance will proceed as scheduled. Economic Ordinance 66A mandates festival continuity. Any further deviation will be met with extreme prejudice. His words died in the echophage, but their meaning lingered like the taste of copper pennies on my tongue. Above us, unauthorized siren tests echoed through the hive's superstructure, their tones cutting through the silence with chilling precision. The emergency klaxons were not wailing warnings but performing harmonic sequences, teaching the echophage to spread through the acoustic infrastructure like infection through blood. Each note was perfectly calculated to resonate with the saint's hyoid, amplifying its song of absence until it could reach every throat in Callist. Kyle suddenly stiffened, his hands pressed to his temples, throat vibrating with visible intensity as he was caught in an echophage event. His body had become a living resonator for the frequencies that had been erased, the corruption spreading through our ranks and using our own voices as instruments for its terrible symphony. The corridors began to constrict around us, organic walls pressing inward with deliberate rhythm. The air grew thick and humid, metallic with the taste of copper, as if we were being squeezed through a throat that had grown too tight. We were being herded, pushed inexorably toward the hive's core, toward whatever vast intelligence waited there to complete its song of unmaking. The cathedral vox crania received us with the hollow reverence of a skull prepared for blessing, its vaulted spaces breathing with anticipation that tasted of incense and old fear. Confessor Hieronymus waited in the transept with shoulders hunched against a cold that belonged to no season, his choir boys arranged in perfect formation beneath the organ loft. 6 voices trained in the ancient silences, their throats raw from rehearsing words that should never be spoken aloud. They did not speak now, but mouthed the 6 silences in perfect unison, shaping absence into something with edges sharp enough to cut reality. Ole deployed his dampeners with the precision of a surgeon placing sutures, each device positioned at calculated intervals where the hive's acoustic matrix converged with the cathedral's foundation stones. 6 subsonic emitters, their machine spirits consecrated with oil and binary prayers, humming with frequencies tuned to oppose the 6-note cadence that had infected everything we touched. The geometry mapped itself across my inner lens, a hexagram drawn in pressure rather than chalk, anchored to this nave like a seal pressed against a bleeding wound. I signed the activation order with hands that trembled despite my training. The dampeners engaged with mechanical precision, their subsonic pulses rolling through the flagstones and into the bones of the hive itself. For the first time since the saint's hyoid had opened its terrible mouth, I heard my own voice as sound rather than shape when I spoke the test phrase. Ave Imperator. The nave returned it with honest echo instead of hunger, and the choir boys lifted their faces as if shutters had opened in heaven itself. The litany of quietus unfurled like a blade drawn from its sheath, 6 intervals of shaped stillness, cutting holes in the air with surgical precision. Between those sacred silences, the dampeners drove their counter-harmonics deep into the hive's infrastructure, nullifying the corruption's spreading frequencies with mathematical certainty. For 37 minutes by the cathedral's chronometer, the world felt possible again. The oppressive humidity lifted, the taste of copper receded from my tongue, and the unauthorized sirens fell silent in their towers. Then the ash began to fall. It drifted through sealed spaces where no ash should exist, each flake perfectly hexagonal and glittering with phosphorescence that made my eyes water to witness. The geometric patterns settled along the pews, across the backs of praying hands, along my gorget's rim with deliberate precision. The corruption had not been defeated, but educated, learning our frequencies, adapting our countermeasures into components of its own terrible design. The inversion began without drama, as most betrayals do. The choir boys bled from their ears in thin, precise lines, each drop falling to stain the ancient wood with perfect circles. The quietus intervals began returning to us wrong, each silence acquiring weight and texture, the absence growing teeth. The great organ's pipes thrummed without wind, their harmonics aligning with the forbidden 6th interval we had sworn never to answer. Ole's auspex lit like a shrine at high mass, readings climbing into impossible regimes. Adaptation, he said, his voice breaking into harmonics that belonged in no human throat. The system learns our nulls faster than we can generate them. The dampeners were no longer shields but beacons, their corrupted frequencies mapping the hexagram we had drawn across the hive with cathedral vox crania at its nexus. Underhive vox relays answered from the depths like whales in a poisonous sea, broadcasting subsonic pretones that rode our own conduits back to the surface. The hardline spat municipal notices overlaid with binharic serpents, unauthorized activation cascading through systems that should have been dark. One dampener flickered, and died like a candle pinched between cruel fingers, its servo skull tumbling from the choir screen to shatter on the stones below. The first pre-feast toll struck then, not metal on metal, but a deep exhalation that rose from the underhive through foundations, through marrow, through the saint's black reliquary behind the altar. 6 seconds of pressure that made the votive flames flatten and the ancient skulls in the crypt tap against their nests like eager fingers. When it released, the cathedral drew breath with me, waiting to hear whether I would answer the call that was no longer entirely human. The descent past sanctioned depths felt like threading a needle with my own spine, each step carrying us deeper into architecture that had never been blessed by human hands. The passages curved with organic precision, their walls ribbed like the interior of some vast throat, breathing around us with humid exhalations that tasted of copper and old prayers. Votive smoke from the cathedral above hung like veils in the pressure left by the toll, while iron doors opened onto shafts lined with plates that were not metal, but something warm and damp that sweated under our gloves. The air climbed like exhalation from a giant mouth, thick as syrup, each breath requiring deliberate effort as if we were drowning in atmosphere made viscous by age and intention. Incense fell into the depths and lost its scent entirely. What I had taken for rust resolved into capillaries feeding pale panels that pulsed to match our heartbeats. Membrane doors presented themselves like epiglottises at prayer, their surfaces slick with condensation that ran in patterns too regular to be natural. Confessor Hieronymus crossed himself and did not speak as we began the descent proper. The shaft widened into a vestibule whose walls flexed at our lumens, muscles startled by light. The passage beyond was ribbed and elegant, a vault of living architecture whose ratios I could feel in my teeth. Hex rosettes of ash bloomed at our steps, each flake perfectly formed and glittering with phosphorescence that made my eyes water. Here, beneath the cathedral's foundation stones, we found Magos Sonat Lexis waiting for us, or what remained of him. His augmetics had fused with the organic walls, cables threading through cartilage coils that pulsed with the rhythm of a heart we could not see. When he spoke, his voice emerged from speakers grown rather than forged, their membranes trembling like vocal cords stretched across frames of yellowed bone. Cantus 66 was never a foundry, he confessed, his words carrying harmonics that made my teeth ache. It was a domestication project, an attempt to harness what slept beneath the hive. The revelation struck like a physical blow as he gestured with arms that had become part of the chamber's structure, indicating schemata carved into the living walls. A bone data altar waited in an ossuary niche, its surface polished by generations of use. When Ol laid his palm upon it, Sonat Lexis's recorded confession emerged through bone as much as air, speaking of the resonator cyst, older than compliance, older than the first pilgrim to spit prayers into Calast's wind. They had taught an animal organ to heal to hymns, fitting a pre-human throat with sainted bone so the Imperium might make it sing. The floor sloped toward a chamber where sound stopped travelling in straight lines, where my vox crackled once and then stilled forever. This was the null chamber, a space so perfectly tuned to absence that prayers whispered within it were consumed before they could reach the air. For one heartbeat there was perfect null, a silence with texture like fine ash, and in that absence, my borders were drawn by what was not there. At the centre stood a dais of fused vertebrae, supporting a slate of pale matter veined like parchment. On it lay a diagram so obvious and obscene my hands wanted to break it, a head and throat rendered as hive, spires as sinuses, the central shaft a larynx, the underhive as bellows. 6 nodes brightened like embers, the coordinates of our dampeners, each marked with the sigil for fold. Vocal tract of the hive, the caption read. The dais pressed meaning into my palms, and the chamber articulated without sound, a thought placed with confessional intimacy in my mentor's dry, authoritative voice. You are in the head. Vertigo tilted the world until the crown became a skull poised above a trained throat. Our quietus net was not a shield, but a laryngeal mask, ready to shape breath that was not ours. The second toll came through stone like breath through a reed, 6 seconds of measured pressure that flattened our lumens and made the organ of the hive shudder beneath our boots. The null chamber hummed with answering vibration, and I understood with growing horror that we had been climbing not down, but up, ascending through the throat of something vast and patient that had been dreaming of song since the stars were young. The second toll faded through stone and marrow, leaving behind a silence that tasted of copper and broken promises. My vox spat a corrupted rune, one dampener dark, its machine spirit fled, the hexagram grid skewed like a broken prayer. The echophage had learned our frequencies faster than we could generate them, turning our countermeasures into components of its own terrible design. I wrote orders the corrupted air would not carry, my stylus carving urgency into blessed parchment. Confessor Hieronymus returned with what I had requested, penitents whose ears had been deliberately damaged, flagellants who heard through bone and scar tissue rather than conventional drums. Their throats bore hexagonal patterns of old wounds, ugly but useful. Pain would anchor them when the echophage came hunting for voices to corrupt. Ol's augmetic hands blurred over the remaining dampeners, rewriting their logic in patterns that made my teeth ache. The Malkadorian configuration, the sigillite's square, etched itself across the cathedral's acoustic matrix with mathematical precision. We positioned the penitents at calculated intervals, their damaged voices creating dissonance that theoretically could not be learned or adapted. They began the counter-hymnal with voices raw from suffering, each word shaped by deliberate mutilation into frequencies that hurt to hear, yet carried absolute necessity. Pain became prayer, became weapon, their scarred throats transforming anguish into acoustic shadows where the corruption could not take root. For 37 minutes by the cathedral's chronometer, our words were words again. Then the saint's hyoid pulsed through its iron prison, teaching the echophage new harmonies. The ashfall resumed, hexagonal flakes rising from pew and rail to hang in spirals that defied gravity. The penitent's scars flushed and trembled to rhythms not their own, while the great organ found breath without wind. The corruption slipped sideways into modes my skull could not house, and the Malkadorian square cracked under pressure it was never designed to withstand. My hardline crackled with a report that chilled my blood. The astropathic choir had gone null-band, their psychic screams replaced by perfect silence. I forced passage to the choir vault through corridors that breathed around us, finding the door yielding like a tongue. Inside, the astropaths had been transformed into instruments of the corruption. Throne cables threaded their spines and looped their tongues, silver rings holding their mouths agape while they sang at warp-band frequencies beyond any human ear. One managed a fragment before the silence claimed him. Do not. And then nothing, the warning devoured before completion. The vibration through the throne mapped our dampener positions with chilling precision, revealing the gap where the 6th node should be, a carved absence waiting to be filled by a willing voice. Understanding struck like a blade between my ribs. The hymn we had chased since the dry dock was bait, promising completion to any throat that could supply its missing note. In providing it, the singer would become the plug in reality's wound, the living seal in a prison keyed to flesh and sacrifice. Saint Callista had not died as martyr, but as willing offering, her hyoid carved with frequencies needed to cage something that hungered for prayer, turned inside out. My vox hissed with a new transmission, riding frequencies that bypassed every encryption. The voice that emerged was dry, authoritative, edged with kindness that had once shaped my faith, Canoness Verina's cadence unfolding the litany of silence in reverse, each sacred phrase unmade and offered like a blade's hilt. My throat tried to answer before training locked my jaw. Ol spun the sigillite square, breaking its hexagonal symmetry, and the emitters shuddered back to partial function. The penitents gasped as pain reasserted their anchor to reality, their voices forming the fifth silence with trembling precision. But the space between that beat and the unspoken sixth filled with attention, vast and patient. The third toll struck then, 6 seconds of pressure that made the cathedral's foundations groan like living bone. In that resonance, something in the hive's depths knocked 6 times against barriers worn thin by centuries of waiting. The high feast of resonance was hours away, and every throat encalloused would soon join the chorus that sang reality backwards into something that should never be. The ash hurricane struck without warning, rising from the underhive through prayer holes and ventilation shafts to engulf the upper hive in a storm that had no wind yet moved with deliberate purpose. Each flake fell in perfect hexagonal formation, glittering with phosphorescence that made my eyes stream, settling on every surface with geometric precision that spoke of intelligence rather than chance. Through the cathedral's stained transparisteel, I watched the tempest transform Callist's crown into something that belonged in fever dreams rather than imperial records. Civilians gathered beneath habspines and gantries, swaying in perfect unison along the processional routes, their movements synchronized to rhythms I could feel in my bones. Their heads tilted at identical angles, mouths open in silent song that made the air shimmer with heat distortion. The corruption had spread beyond Cantus 66, beyond the cathedral's blessed walls, taking root in every throat that had heard the unauthorized sirens practice their harmonic sequences. They hummed without conscious thought, their faces bearing the serene expression of those who had found something beautiful in the promise of unmaking. The Vox Blacks maintained formation through discipline alone, but I could see the strain, etching lines around their eyes. Trooper Lyra's scarred fingers tapped 6-beat patterns against her lasgun's stock without conscious volition, while Serra's breathing quickened behind her rebreather as she fought the urge to hum along with frequencies that bypassed rational thought. When I called Lyra's name, she startled as if waking from deep sleep, eyes wide with the horror of recognition. "Interrogator," she whispered. "I can hear it in my bones. The song wants to be finished." My data slate chimed with another temporal anomaly, a confession bearing my mentor's cipher, time-stamped from decades past, yet arriving in our present like a blade thrust between ribs. Canoness. Verena's voice emerged from the speakers with the dry authority I remembered from my novitiate years, each word precisely measured. The Saint's hyoid was never meant to be a weapon, Kalia. It was a key, and I have spent 30 years preparing the lock. When the 6th note comes, you will understand the necessity of sacrifice. Ol found me at the transept rail with ash gathered like frost along his robes, his augmetic eye dragging its shutter as if fatigued beyond repair. He set a wafer of beaten copper on the rail between us, stamped with Verena's cipher and the sigil of Sonat Lexis entwined like lovers' fingers. "Payment, proof, penance," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that vibrated in my teeth. "Your canoness ordered the bone installed, not under duress, under design. She believed the hyoid would domesticate the cyst given proper liturgy and geometry." The revelation struck with the force of a macro-cannon shell. Every authorization, every sanction, every carefully placed cipher had been preparation for this moment. My mentor had orchestrated my presence here with the precision of a master strategist, using my voice, trained from childhood in the exact frequencies needed, as the final component in a trap that had been decades in the making. Another dampener failed with a sound like breaking glass, its status light flickering from green to red to nothing. The sigillite's square collapsed into chaos, our counter-frequencies becoming fuel for the corruption's spreading song. Through the hardline came reports that chilled my blood. Macro-cannon batteries swiveling without orders, their targeting systems jammed by harmonic interference that made their machine spirits sing backwards liturgies to something that hungered for prayer turned inside out. The song had left throats entirely, colonizing matter itself. Conveyor belts rolled where no power ran, their teeth ratcheting in soft syncopation that matched the heartbeats of those nearby. Doors sighed and sealed in six-step cycles without petition to their machine spirits, while aqueduct valves pulsed with deliberate rhythm, far from any operator's station. The corruption was transforming the hive's infrastructure into a single massive instrument, each component tuned to frequencies that predated human understanding. The fifth pre-feast toll struck like a hammer blow against reality's anvil, 6 seconds of measured pressure that made the cathedral's ancient stones weep condensation in hexagonal patterns. The votive flames flattened against their wicks, while the skulls in the crypt rattled in their nests like eager children. My auspex, which had become more lyre than guide, suddenly offered a single clarity that made my blood freeze in my veins. The display showed my voice print threaded through the hive's acoustic matrix like gold wire through shroud cloth, my phonemes embedded in harmonics that spread across districts I had never visited. At the edge of the analysis, an index number incremented with my pulse, a countdown that matched my heartbeat syllable for syllable. The saint's hyoid pulsed through its iron prison, teaching the corruption new harmonies with each beat, preparing the frequencies that would transform willing sacrifice into living seal. The ashfall pressed against the sealed doors with deliberate rhythm, each gust carrying whispers in languages that predated human settlement on Vespera Secundus. The hive was breathing, and its breath was the 6-note cadence, a lullaby of unmaking that promised to lull the entire planet into permanent, terrible silence. Hours remained until the high feast of resonance, and I understood with growing certainty that the song had been waiting not for any voice, but for mine specifically, trained, prepared, and delivered to this moment by the one person I had trusted above all others. The central shaft rose before us like a larynx carved from living stone and grown to cathedral scale, its walls ribbed with cartilage that pulsed in rhythm with something vast and patient in the depths below. All 6 dampener conduits converged here like arteries feeding a diseased heart, their cables threading through organic architecture that had grown around imperial infrastructure with deliberate, hungry precision. The air was thick enough to taste, humid with exhalations that carried the copper penny flavor of old blood and the sweet decay of flowers left too long on graves. Machine spirits shrieked from the walls in frequencies that bypassed human hearing, their binary cant warped into something that sounded like pleas for a final, terrible blessing. The hive was not merely listening, but actively participating, drawing us deeper into its embrace with each breath. Ductwork flexed like muscular tissue, carrying not air, but harmonics that made my bones resonate in sympathetic vibration. The temperature dropped with each mechanical exhalation, frost forming in hexagonal patterns across every surface, while condensation ran in rivulets that spelled out fragments of the inverted litany of silence. I drew my pistol and sighted on Old's skull implant, the decision sitting in my finger joints like grit. He had admitted complicity by survival. Too many doors had opened at his whisper. Too many machine spirits had bowed to corrupted frequencies at his touch. The urge to cleanse was taut as wire, yet the approaching 6th toll demanded pragmatism over purity. "Kill me," he said softly, syllables breaking into harmonics at their edges, "and you will still need access only I possess." He presented his hands, flesh palm up, augmetic palm closed, an offering and a calculation. I bound him by dolorous oath with my own blood on the cog teeth of his manipulator, pressing my signet into the cut until the seal drank deeply. The ritual was older than the Imperium, words carved in high Gothic across parchment, made from the skin of martyrs. Each syllable drew blood from my tongue as I spoke it, the price of compelling loyalty from one whose augmetics had already begun singing the corruption's song. "By pain and duty," I said, voice steady, despite the cold that bit through my carapace. "Fail me, and I will unmake your name in the Emperor's hearing." The chamber breathed around us with deliberate rhythm as Ol approached the primary interface where all 6 conduits met in a crown of sockets shaped like vertebral facets. His augmetic hands trembled as they traced Binharic glyphs carved into what had once been blessed adamantine, but now resembled bone worn smooth by countless prayers. The machine spirit within responded with reluctance, its consciousness fragmented by decades of exposure to frequencies that violated every principle of sacred mechanics. I countered the corruption's influence with the exorcism canticle, my voice cutting through the humid darkness like blessed silver through diseased flesh. The ancient syllables created pockets of silence where reality could reassert its proper geometry, each word shaped by training that had begun in childhood and been refined through years of exposure to things that should not be. But the effort cost me blood, each phrase drawing crimson from my lips as the frequencies required to unmake the echophage demanded payment in flesh and spirit. Ol recited permissions older than the foundry's legal existence, dust scripts in Binharik that had the color of bone and the taste of bitter herbs. His flesh eye wept tears of machine oil, while his augmetic counterpart flickered through spectrums that hurt to witness, processing data streams that belonged to no human understanding of acoustics or physics. When he pressed his augmetic palm into the primary port, conductive filaments slid beneath his skin like worms seeking heat, and his pupils pinholed until only augmetic iris remained. The corruption answered with its own cant, frequencies that transformed his augmetics into instruments of its spreading song. The shaft's membranes flexed to the rhythm of my canticle, at first in compliance, then in contest, and then in something like mimicry. When my voice dropped to a hush, the ductwork drooped. When I rose, they tensed like cords readying to phonate. It was learning me, adapting to my frequencies with predatory intelligence. My auspex died with a sound like breaking glass, its machine spirit fleeing rather than process readings that violated every principle of physics it had been programmed to understand. Through the hardline came reports that chilled my blood, macro cannon batteries swiveling without orders, their targeting systems compromised by harmonic interference that made their machine spirits sing backwards liturgies to something that hungered for prayer, turned inside out. From the vents above came a whisper that made my breath catch, my mother's voice singing a lullaby from my childhood, a melody I had not heard since the Hablock's heating failed and we huddled together against the cold. The chamber temperature plummeted further as the hive drew a deep, chilling breath, and somewhere in the ductwork a child's name was called with the gentleness of a benediction. The sixth toll approached like a predator you pretend you do not see, pressure building in stone and skin, in teeth and nail beds, a sublime ache that promised relief if only I would answer it. The rails went white with rime, while my breath hung motionless in the frigid air. Ol's body shuddered as the interface dragged more of him inward, his flesh hand flexing around emptiness with mechanical precision. Then the vents sang in my own cadence, not echo, but anticipation, a perfect copy from a future I had not yet reached. We succeed only by finishing it, my voice said from behind the grills, from beneath the plating, from inside the thin bones around my ears. The words carried weight beyond their meaning, each syllable charged with the authority of prophecy, fulfilled rather than spoken. The ductwork trembled like vocal cords awaiting the final note, and I understood with growing certainty that the song had been waiting not for any voice, but for mine specifically, trained, prepared, and delivered to this moment by the one person I had trusted above all others. The cult adepts emerged from concealed alcoves like surgeons prepared for a blasphemous operation. Their throats opened wide to accommodate the small organ pipes that transformed them into living instruments of corruption. Each carried resonance projectors built from bone and sanctified scrap, devices that carved wounds in reality's geometry with every pulse. When they activated their weapons, the air fractured like glass struck by hammers, releasing harmonics that made my teeth ache and my vision blur with patterns that hurt to perceive directly. I marked their positions with prayer tap and armed my null charges, crude reliquaries of violence wrapped in pitch resin and bound with seals inked in grave dust, designed to tear voids in sound rather than pierce armor. We hurled them like censers between the third and fourth beats of their inverted litany, when the echophage inhaled. The detonations arrived as soft, obscene collapses, the air imploding into pockets of honest quiet that flashed like cold fire. In those brief bubbles of silence, our las beams found their targets, and our vox coughed syllables like blood. The tactical miracle came when Sarah's charges collapsed part of the throat shaft, flooding the chamber with warm slurry that glowed with phosphorescence and carried the metallic taste of copper mixed with something sweeter and more corrupt. We waded through the deluge as reality reasserted itself in the spaces where organic architecture had been destroyed, creating islands of normal physics amid an ocean of acoustic impossibility. Ole sagged at the interface, oil and blood indistinguishable where they ran from his compromised augmetics. Through gritted teeth stained crimson, he delivered the revelation that changed everything. "The reversed litany is a key," he rasped, each word splitting into harmonics that tried to birth their own meanings. St. Callista's hyoid was never a weapon. It is a lockpick for a prison. The hymn is the cage. The sixth interval supplies the plug, a living seal. The faithful become the door. Above us, the ash storm raged with renewed fury while my hardline crackled with reports that chilled my blood. Fleet Auspex had detected our hymn at 66 Hz, lashing itself to vox static and reflecting into the void. Neighbor systems answered with sympathetic rings, an echo pattern spreading across the sector like frost on glass. The corruption had escaped Vespera Secundus, riding on radio waves and astropathic transmissions, teaching distant throats to sing backwards liturgies to something that hungered for prayer turned inside out. A data packet burst against my vambrace, bearing my own cipher and a timestamp 12 hours ahead. The message unrolled inside my skull with the intimacy of a whispered confession. "The sixth note is not addition," my voice told me from a future full of ash. "It is erasure. The singer becomes the plug, their identity sacrificed to seal the demon by making the faithful the key." Understanding struck like a blade between my ribs. St. Callista had not died as martyr, but as willing offering. Her hyoid carved with frequencies needed to cage something that hungered for prayer turned inside out. My mentor had orchestrated my presence here with decades of careful preparation, using my voice, trained from childhood in the exact harmonics needed, as the final component in a trap that required willing sacrifice to complete. The high feast of resonance was not celebration, but ritual. A billion souls offered as witnesses to the moment when one throat would sing itself into eternal silence to save them all. The shaft's membranes drew tight like vocal cords poised to speak, and in the hush that followed, I felt the shape of the missing interval, waiting where my throat met my will. The dais of fused vertebrae waited like an altar prepared for the only sacrifice that mattered, its surface worn smooth by centuries of anticipation and slick with condensation that tasted of copper and old prayers. The saint's hyoid pulsed within its iron reliquary, with light that bypassed my eyes to burn directly into my marrow, each throb matching my heartbeat with predatory precision. Around us, the choir of servitors reached crescendo, their throat pipes glowing with internal phosphorescence as impossible harmonies wove together into something that was not quite sound, but the shape that sound left when it was unmade. Ole caught my wrist as I approached, the oath cut on his palm reopening to bleed oil and crimson along the crease. "Use me," he gasped through lips that split into harmonics. "My augmetics can carry the interval. I will. Be the plug." His flesh eye wept machine tears while his augmetic counterpart flickered through spectrums of desperate calculation. But the hive rejected his offer with a pulse that made the chamber's walls contract like muscle. The interface brightened when I drew breath and dimmed when he did, confirming what I had known since the first impossible song in the dry dock. It needed my voice specifically, trained from childhood in the litany of silence, shaped by decades of preparation I had mistaken for education. I understood now why the motifs had aligned with such terrible precision. The hexagonal patterns, the recurring sixes, the silence that was presence rather than absence. all elements of a ritual designed to culminate in this moment, when one throat would speak the word that unmade itself. The sixth note was not addition, but subtraction, not completion, but erasure, the singer offering their identity as payment to seal a breach that threatened to consume reality. The chamber's temperature plummeted as I stepped onto the dais, frost forming in perfect rosettes across surfaces that pulsed like living tissue. The air grew thick enough to taste, humid with the breath of something vast and patient that had been waiting since before human voices first shaped prayer into sound. Above us, the high feast of resonance approached its moment, sirens murmuring to a city already swaying in anticipation. I placed my boots within the hex scratched into the bone slate by hands that had loved me and began to sing. The first intervals emerged with the clarity of blessed silver, each syllable precisely shaped by training that had prepared me for this sacrifice without my knowledge. But as the melody progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, I felt something fundamental changing, not in the world around me, but in the very essence of who I was. Present tense, because there is no future. I sing the sixth note. It rises without rising, a subtraction shaped by cartilage and faith, and the chamber receives it like a wound receives salt. My name loosens like a tooth. The world slips its purchase on me as I unsay myself syllable by syllable, becoming the willing absence that will hold the demon in its prison of silence. The reliquary blazes with colourless light, and in that radiance I become not martyr, but mechanism, the living seal in a cage keyed to flesh and sacrifice, the throat that sings itself into eternal quiet so that others might speak freely. The hive draws one final breath and holds it, waiting for the door that will never open again. My voice threaded through the hive's organic infrastructure like blessed silver through diseased flesh, each syllable of the erasure interval carving wounds, in reality, that bled silence instead of sound. The dais drank my breath and returned it as absence, a contour fitted to the wound the saint had left behind. Organ membranes thrashed like nets in a storm, each stretched skin in the shaft bucking against the frequencies that unmade them, phosphorescent fluid pooling in hexagonal patterns as their housings split and died. The demolition charges bloomed in perfect rhythm with my fading identity, each explosion timed to the intervals where my name dissolved into component syllables. Sarah's grimy thumb broke seals in a cadence taught by pain, and our null sensors collapsed pockets of air into bright cold voids. The throat shaft folded inward, like a flower closing against winter, organic architecture sealing the demon song back into the saint's hyoid, with finality that tasted of copper pennies and altar wine. Above us, the high feast sirens stuttered and fell silent as their machine spirits fled, rather than participate in the corruption's final moments. Fleet confirmation rode the hardline in voices that sounded like men again. Broadcast aborted. Cathedral net dark. Signal contained. The unauthorized harmonics that had infected the hive's infrastructure died with wet, gasping sounds, leaving behind only the honest echo of stone and steel freed from blasphemous influence. The cost revealed itself in measurements of flesh and spirit that no ledger could contain. Kale lay fused to the walls where the corruption had used him as a resonator, his augmetics singing subsonic regret. Sarah cradled Lyra, whose medici scar wept machine oil from eyes that had seen too much of what should never be. Ol slumped at the interface, consciousness scattered across data streams that belonged to no human understanding, his flesh hand trembling as he made the sign that hurts to draw. The choir boys who had survived the counter-ritual bled from their ears in thin, precise lines, their voices forever changed by exposure to frequencies that existed in the spaces between sounds. Confessor Hieronymus knelt among them, whispering prayers I could no longer hear, his devotion vibrating the bone like a hand on a door that would not open. I completed the reversed litany without a voice to finish it with, the final syllable my name spoken once and then erased, sealing the breach with the only currency the lock would take. The reliquary cooled from colourless to merely cold, the saint's hyoid pulsing once more beneath iron walls before stilling forever. The hive settled into a silence that was not absence, but presence, the quiet of a throat that had learned to hold its breath. Yet even in victory, the lingering horror remained. A tremor arrived from the far edge of knowing, not through stone or air, but through instruments meant to measure stars, the faintest thread at 66 hertz, riding the void like ash rides wind. It touched the cathedral's dead lumens and made them flicker as if remembering a pulse. The hive did not answer. The lock held. But somewhere beyond the sky, something had learned the path and sang it back, very softly, as if practicing a prayer that would one day find new throats to corrupt. I dictate this final report from quarantine cell Hex 7 beneath the cathedral's deepest foundation, my words captured by a skull servitor whose auditory senses flinch when I exhale. The walls weep condensation in hexagonal patterns when I speak, betraying the truth that I have become something other than what I was. My designation reads, Interrogator Militant Kalia Voss on the data slate, but the name feels like borrowed clothing, ill-fitting and without resonance. When the Medici asked me to speak it for the record, something in the room held its breath, and only silence emerged where sound should have been. The cost of the ritual was precise. My identity became the currency needed to seal the breach. My voice print now matches the saint's hyoid bone perfectly, a living relic whose frequencies exist in the spaces between sounds. When they place an auspex against my throat, the machine's spirit purrs with recognition, detecting membranes that pulse with their own rhythm, transforming every breath into frequencies that bypass conventional hearing. Ol exists between data streams now, his augmetics shattered beyond repair, tracing hexagonal patterns in dust with trembling flesh fingers. Sarah and Lyra bear reassignment with faces etched in silence that speaks louder than screams, their eyes holding too much understanding of what was prevented and what was lost. The choir boys who survived sit with wool pressed behind their ears, their mouths full of prayers they are forbidden to complete. Hive Calloused bears the mark of a black shrine, its coordinates struck from all but the most classified records. Cantus 66 is sealed by inquisitorial decree, its bioacoustic infrastructure collapsed into silent monument. The high feast of resonance is abolished, replaced by the festival of necessary quiet, 6 hours of absolute silence in remembrance of what should never sing again. My edict spreads through sector communications like blessed contagion. Never answer frequencies at 66 Hz. Initiate protocol hex cant erasure if detected. Report all instances of backwards liturgy. Yet Fleet Auspex continues detecting resonance patterns in neighboring systems, faint echoes of the 6-note cadence threading through void static like infection through blood. The demon's song has learned a path through reality's fabric, riding warp lanes and astropathic transmissions to seek new throats in distant systems. Each report arrives with coordinates that form geometric patterns across star charts, suggesting intelligence rather than random spread. In my cell, the lumen flickers with each breath, brightening when I inhale, dimming when I shape nothing against my teeth. I practice the art of not speaking, my throat a perfect vessel for absence. The silence is not empty, but gravid with what was, what is, and what will be. The echo of a song gone to seek new choristers in the vast indifference between stars. The recorder skull scratches truth into vellum with mechanical persistence, waiting for my closing statement. I lean toward its sensors so the machine can feel what it cannot hear, shaping my breath into the only warning that matters. If you can hear this, you are already singing. End.